What happens when a frozen harbor in the middle of nowhere becomes more strategically important than the busiest ports in America? You're watching the quiet transformation of global trade patterns, and it's happening faster than anyone thought possible. I've been analyzing global infrastructure and trade patterns for decades, and I can tell you that the Port of Churchill represents something unprecedented in modern economic history. Not just because a remote Arctic facility has become a major shipping hub, but because it demonstrates how quickly global commerce can reorganize itself when traditional infrastructure becomes unreliable or politically volatile. The official story, to the extent that most people are even aware of what's happening, focuses on climate change opening Arctic shipping routes and Canadian investment in northern infrastructure. But what actually happened was far more consequential than environmental adaptation or regional development. What happened was that global shipping giants made a calculated decision that a frozen harbor in northern Manitoba was more reliable than the traditional ports that have anchored American trade for over a century. Let me put this in perspective because the scale of this transformation is difficult to grasp until you understand the geography involved. The Port of Churchill sits on Hudson Bay, more than 1,000 miles north of the American border, accessible for only a few months each year when ice conditions permit. By any conventional measure, it's the least logical place to build a major international shipping hub. The fact that it has become exactly that tells you everything you need to know about the state of American infrastructure reliability. The psychological moment when this transformation became inevitable came during a series of port disruptions along the American West Coast that revealed how vulnerable traditional shipping routes had become to political and labor instability. Asian shipping companies that had built their North American strategies around predictable access to Los Angeles, Long Beach, and Seattle discovered that predictability was exactly what American ports could no longer guarantee. When port operations become subject to sudden strikes, when cargo handling gets delayed by political disputes, when shipping schedules become hostage to domestic American conflicts that have nothing to do with international trade, global companies don't just absorb those costs and continue operating. They look for alternatives. And increasingly, that alternative has been a route that most Americans didn't even know existed. The Churchill route offers something that American ports had lost: boring reliability. Ships arrive, cargo gets processed, goods move to market according to schedule. There's no political theater, no sudden disruptions, no uncertainty about whether labor disputes will shut down operations for weeks at a time. For companies moving billions of dollars worth of goods, that predictability is worth far more than geographical convenience. Climate change accelerated this transformation in ways that few observers anticipated. As Arctic ice patterns shifted and shipping seasons extended, routes that had been theoretical for decades suddenly became practical. The Northwest Passage and related Arctic shipping corridors offered not just alternative routes to traditional shipping lanes, but potentially superior routes for certain cargo flows. Canadian investment in Churchill infrastructure wasn't driven by grand geopolitical strategy. It was driven by recognition of a practical opportunity. When global shipping companies started expressing serious interest in Arctic routes, Canada made the investments necessary to accommodate that interest. Port facilities were expanded, rail connections were upgraded, cargo handling capacity was increased. The boring work of infrastructure development that makes reliable commerce possible. Meanwhile, American port infrastructure was struggling with political dysfunction that made long-term planning nearly impossible. Investments in port modernization got caught up in congressional disputes. Labor relations deteriorated into adversarial stalemates. Environmental regulations created uncertainty about expansion possibilities. The cumulative effect was that American ports became more expensive and less reliable at exactly the moment when global competition was intensifying. Asian shipping companies didn't abandon American ports out of hostility or competitive strategy. They reduced dependence on American infrastructure because American infrastructure had become a business risk. When schedule reliability becomes uncertain, when labor disputes can shut down operations with little warning, when political conflicts can disrupt cargo flows for extended periods, rational business planning requires alternative arrangements. The Churchill route provided those alternatives with efficiency that surprised even its proponents. Cargo that traditionally flowed through West Coast American ports could reach central North American markets more quickly through Hudson Bay than through traditional southern routes. The geography that had always made Churchill seem remote actually made it central once Arctic shipping became viable. What makes this transformation particularly significant is how it demonstrates the relationship between infrastructure reliability and geopolitical influence. American ports had maintained their dominance not just because of geographical advantages, but because they offered predictable access to North American markets. When that predictability disappeared, geographical advantages became irrelevant. Canadian officials understood this dynamic and positioned themselves accordingly. Instead of competing directly with American port capacity, they offered something different: institutional stability that made long-term shipping contracts viable. Companies could plan multi-year arrangements through Churchill with confidence that political instability wouldn't disrupt operations or void agreements. The economic implications extend far beyond shipping logistics into questions about how global supply chains adapt to political instability in major economies. When traditional infrastructure hubs become unreliable, commerce doesn't stop. It reroutes. And once those new routes become established, they create their own momentum and institutional relationships that persist even after original problems are resolved. Communities along traditional American shipping routes are beginning to feel these changes in employment, tax revenues, and economic activity. Port cities that built their identities around international trade are discovering that international trade can flow through other channels when local conditions become problematic. The economic multiplier effects of major ports extend deep into regional economies, and when port activity declines, those effects reverse quickly. From a strategic perspective, the Churchill phenomenon represents something more concerning than simple economic competition. It represents the emergence of alternative infrastructure networks that reduce global dependence on American systems. When international commerce can flow efficiently without American participation, American leverage in trade disputes and international negotiations diminishes accordingly. The technology dimension of this transformation is equally important, but less visible. Modern shipping depends on integrated information systems, automated cargo handling, and digital coordination between multiple parties across vast distances. Churchill's development incorporated these technologies from the beginning, while many traditional American ports are struggling to retrofit older systems with modern capabilities. Canadian investment in Churchill wasn't just about building port infrastructure, it was about creating an integrated logistics system that could handle modern shipping demands with efficiency that older, more congested ports couldn't match. When efficiency advantages combine with reliability advantages, the competitive equation shifts dramatically in favor of newer infrastructure. The environmental dimension adds another layer of complexity to this story. Arctic shipping routes, while enabled by climate change, also offer potential environmental advantages through shorter distances and reduced fuel consumption for certain cargo flows. When environmental considerations align with economic efficiency, the combination becomes extremely powerful in driving long-term changes in global shipping patterns. What American policymakers failed to anticipate was how quickly alternative routes could become competitive once they became viable. The assumption was that geographical advantages and existing infrastructure would maintain American port dominance regardless of political or operational problems. But geography only provides advantage when it's supported by reliable institutional performance. The Churchill transformation also highlights the relationship between climate change and geopolitical opportunity. Countries that adapt quickly to changing physical conditions can capture strategic advantages that reshape global relationships. Canada's Arctic strategy wasn't designed primarily to compete with American infrastructure, but it has had that effect by providing alternatives that didn't previously exist. For shipping companies planning routes and investments over decades, the Churchill option represents something more valuable than an alternative port. It represents proof that global infrastructure networks can develop outside traditional American-dominated systems. Once that proof exists, it changes calculations about future investments and long-term strategic relationships. The most sobering aspect of this transformation from an American perspective is how avoidable it was. The institutional problems that made American ports less reliable were policy choices, not inevitable circumstances. Labor relations, regulatory frameworks, and infrastructure investment priorities could have been managed differently. Instead, political dysfunction created opportunities that competitors were quick to exploit. As global trade continues to evolve around Churchill and similar alternative infrastructure, the question isn't whether traditional American shipping dominance can be restored. The question is whether American institutional systems can adapt quickly enough to remain competitive in a world where reliability has become more valuable than raw capacity or geographical advantage. The Port of Churchill represents more than a successful infrastructure development project. It represents a preview of how global systems reorganize themselves when traditional powers become unreliable. The fact that a frozen harbor in northern Canada can become strategically more important than established American ports should serve as a warning about how quickly influence can shift when institutional competence fails. For observers trying to understand how global power adapts to changing conditions, Churchill offers important lessons about the relationship between infrastructure, reliability, and strategic influence. When countries provide what others need with consistency and competence, geographical disadvantages become irrelevant. When traditional powers become unpredictable, alternatives that seemed impossible become inevitable. What's happening in the Arctic isn't just about shipping or infrastructure development, it's about how influence migrates toward reliability in an uncertain world. And once that migration begins, reversing it requires not just infrastructure investment, but institutional restoration that may take decades to achieve. By then, the new patterns may have become too established to change, and what seemed like a temporary adaptation becomes a permanent transformation of global relationships.